Darian Fenton.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Well, I want to make a contribution to part two, but start by responding to that Minister, and I find it very interesting that he thinks he knows better than the UNHCR, the Human Rights Commission, various refugee organisations, a range of people who came and opposed this bill very strenuously to the Select Committee and have been ignored and have been, as we expected they would be, and sadly as they expected they would be as well. And whether it is a breach of the convention or not, no doubt will be tested in time, and I look forward to that occasion and that Minister having to front up in international fora and justify this bill. Now, this part two deals with just one issue really, which is about changing one of the forms from the Immigration Act 2009 to deal with the supplying a warrant for mass arrivals. I wanted to go over the issue of mass arrivals and the definition of mass arrivals again, because if we go right back to the very beginning of this bill, and the justification for it was, and including in the regulatory impact statement, that it would be a mass arrival for the purpose of this bill means an arrival by a substantial group of people by sea or air. And then they went on to talk about assumptions around the bill that were made around the regulatory impact statement, that there would be 500 people involved in a mass arrival. Now, this was, when it first came to Parliament, was over a year ago, and it was around about the time that there had been a steel-hulled vessel arrive in Canada with 500 people in it, and that sent our ministers into overdrive to find an excuse to introduce this bill to cover up for the cabbage boat that was happening at the time, that was coming down the river or going up the river. I can't remember exactly what it was. But then, when the bill actually arrived in front of the Parliament, the mass arrival that's referred to in the warrant was 11 people. Now, that does not constitute a substantial group of people by sea or air. It's 11 people. That is ridiculous. So that's it's a joke. Surely it's a joke. 11 people is a mass arrival, and New Zealand under this bill could not cope with 11 people arriving by boat or by air and claiming asylum, when we actually cope with something like 300 asylum seekers every year who come by plane. So that was crazy. And then we moved on to the last part of the joke, which was Peter Dunn proposing, which has just been passed in part one, that the mass arrival definition be moved to 30. So now what we're saying in a bill...
Order. I'm listening very carefully. And part two is about consequential amendments. And I'm just waiting for the member to draw this debate into the subject matter of part two. Darian Fenton.
Point of order, Mr Chair.
A point of order.
Perhaps you can help me with this, because the Minister started off the debate with a fairly wide-ranging discussion on part two. He did, and so I was actually, I am concentrating on mass arrivals, which is what the warrant is about, so I thought that actually I was addressing part two in a way that the Minister had not.
Yeah, I was kicking his shin under the table. Now. Look, let's not try and justify where we are. We try and keep this debate focused on part two.
Okay, well, I am concentrating on the warrant, which is in part two. If you read the bill, everybody, you will see that what the schedule is about altering the warrant, which applies to mass arrival. That's the major amendment here, and that's what I've been talking about, Mr Chair, is about mass arrivals. What is a mass arrival? And under this bill, it started at 500, then it went to 11, and now it's 30. So, it's really confusing. Well, when is a mass arrival a mass arrival? Is it 500? No, obviously not. Obviously not. And in the meantime, we have all sorts of other mass arrivals, if I may say so, Mr Chair. And I wanted to mention in particular a mass arrival of something like 1,000 workers being employed by Weta Digital, overseas workers, that's a mass arrival.
Come on. Look. the member's drawing an extremely long bow, and the changing of a form under the consequential amendments is the member's gotten outside the scope of what Part 2 is. So I just remind her and ask her to come back.
Okay, well, I'll come back to mass arrivals if I may, Mr Chair, because that is the major change in the form in Schedule 2. The only reason we've got Schedule 2 is because we have a bill that deals with mass arrivals, and Form 5 is the warrant of commitment mass arrival warrant. And so the whole reason that we have this form in Schedule 2 is because we have a bill that describes what mass arrival is. So, you know, I go back to my earlier point, Mr Chair. I'm still very, very unclear about the original justice. Mr Chair.
All right. Dr. David Clark.
Mr. Chair, I confess I was looking to